Who let the cleaning staff sit in a strategy meeting? Daniel Whitmore didn't raise his voice, but it carried anyway, sharp enough to slice through the low hum of the $10 million boardroom. And just like that, the quiet stopped, chairs stilled, eyes shifted, and a few soft chuckles slipped out before anyone could stop them, all directed at the young black woman seated at the far end of the polished glass table. Naomi Carter didn't look up right away, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of a slim silver laptop, her posture straight but unforced. Like she wasn't borrowing the seat but owning it. Daniel finally glanced up from the contract in front of him, irritation flashing first, then confusion, because she wasn't moving, wasn't apologizing, wasn't scrambling to leave the way people usually did when he spoke like that. The sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the edge of her face, outlining her calm expression in a soft glow that didn't match the tension tightening the room. Someone near the middle cleared their throat. Another leaned closer to whisper, "She's not supposed to be here." But no one actually said it out loud, because something about the way she sat there made it feel less certain than it should have been. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he set his pen down, the faint click echoing louder than expected against the marble floors. "This is a restricted meeting," he added, colder now, more deliberate, his gaze fixed directly on her, waiting for hesitation, for discomfort, for anything that would confirm what he had already decided she was. But Naomi simply lifted her eyes to meet his, steady, unflinching, not defiant, not submissive, just present. And that pause stretched a second too long, long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for the balance to shift in a way no one could quite name. Then, without asking, without announcing, she turned the laptop slightly toward the table and pressed a single key. The screen behind her flickered to life. Numbers, projections, clean lines of data appearing with a precision that made a few of the senior analysts lean forward instinctively. Daniel frowned, the movement subtle but unmistakable. "This isn't a classroom," he said, reaching toward the remote to shut it down. But even as his hand hovered, the numbers on the screen continued to move, building, aligning, revealing something that hadn't been there before, something no one else in that room had managed to solve in the last 48 hours. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one moved at all. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector and the quiet, steady rhythm of Naomi's breathing as she remained exactly where she was, not rushing, not proving, just allowing the truth to unfold in front of people who had already decided not to see her. The numbers did not just appear, they aligned, each projection tightening the margins in a way that made the previous version look careless, almost blind, and one by one the executives who had been leaning back in their chairs now leaned forward, elbows on the glass, eyes narrowing not in doubt but in focus. Naomi did not rush to explain. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply let the data sit there, breathing on its own. Daniel's hand remained suspended above the remote for a fraction longer before he slowly pulled it back, his expression unreadable now, not dismissive anymore, but not yet convinced either. "Where did you get this model?" he asked, his tone controlled, quieter than before, but carrying something sharper underneath. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, her voice calm, even, measured in a way that did not match the tension in the room. "It is built on your last 3/4 of performance, adjusted for the liability exposure you overlooked." A faint ripple moved through the table. Someone shifted in their seat. Another flipped quickly through printed pages, as if searching for confirmation that had never been there. Daniel's eyes flicked back to the screen, then to the documents in front of him, then back to her, the rhythm of certainty beginning to fracture. "We did not overlook anything," he said, but the conviction in his voice did not land the way it had minutes ago. Naomi did not argue. She simply reached forward and tapped once more. The slide changed, a clause highlighted in precise detail, small, buried, easy to miss if no one was looking for it, but impossible to ignore now that it was illuminated. "Page 14, she said softly. "Third paragraph, line 3. The room went still again, but this time it was different, not frozen by judgment, but held by realization. One of the senior analysts pulled the document closer, his brow tightening as he scanned, then paused, then scanned again, slower this time. "Wait," he muttered under his breath. And that single word carried more weight than anything said before. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the faint reflection of the screen flickering across his face as he finally leaned forward, closer to the table, closer to her, closer to something he had not expected to confront. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the laptop, not defensive, not triumphant, just steady, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. The air in the room felt heavier now, thicker, like a storm building without a sound. Daniel flipped to the page himself, his fingers moving faster than before, not to prove her wrong, but to confirm what he was starting to see. And as his eyes tracked the line she had pointed out, something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that follows. Daniel did not look up immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the clause as if reading it again might change what it said, but it did not. The wording was precise, deliberate, and now that it had been pointed out, impossible to unsee. A slow exhale left him as he leaned back slightly, the leather chair creaking under a weight that had nothing to do with posture. Around the table the energy had shifted completely. No one was amused anymore. No one was whispering. They were watching, waiting, measuring what would happen next. The analyst who had spoken earlier cleared his throat and pushed his glasses up. "She is right," he said quietly, almost reluctantly, but the words landed hard. Another voice followed, softer but firmer. "If we sign this as is, the liability shifts entirely onto us." A pause, then a longer silence, the kind that stretches because no one wants to be the next to speak. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, a habit, controlled, restrained, but it betrayed the calculation happening beneath the surface. His gaze finally lifted, not to the screen this time, not to the documents, but to Naomi, really looking at her now, not at her clothes, not at the badge clipped to her jacket, but at her. "Who are you?" he asked, the question simple, but heavier than anything he had said before. Naomi did not rush to answer. She held his gaze for a second, then another, steady, composed. "Naomi Carter," she said, her voice even, offering nothing more. The room felt that answer, felt what it did not include. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to justify her presence. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in reassessment, like he was recalibrating something internal that had been set wrong from the beginning. "You are not on this team," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement he was trying to confirm. Naomi shook her head once, small, controlled. "No, I am not." A faint murmur moved through the room again, quieter this time, more uncertain. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his attention fully anchored now. "Then how did you get access to this data?" The question was sharper, more direct, but it no longer carried dismissal, it carried need. Naomi's fingers rested lightly against the edge of her laptop as she answered. The data was not hidden, it was just not being questioned. That landed differently. A few heads turned, a few eyes dropped back to the documents in front of them as if seeing them for the first time. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, then looked back at the screen, the projection still running, still holding, not collapsing under scrutiny, and that was the part he could not ignore. Not anymore. The door at the far end of the room opened quietly, but no one noticed at first. The shift had already happened inside the room. The balance had already tilted, and as Daniel straightened slightly, drawing in a slow breath, the realization settled in deeper. Not just that she was correct, but that he had almost dismissed the only person who saw what no one else did. The door clicked softly against the wall as it opened, and this time the sound did not go unnoticed. A man stepped inside with measured confidence, his tailored suit catching the light from the windows, his presence shifting the air without a single word. Several heads turned immediately, recognition flickering across their faces. Daniel's gaze followed a second later, his posture straightening instinctively as the man approached the table. "Sorry to interrupt," the visitor said, his voice calm but carrying authority that did not need volume. "I was told this meeting was already in progress." Daniel nodded once, composed but alert now. "We are reviewing final terms," he replied, but his tone had changed, less absolute, more careful. The man's eyes moved across the room, scanning faces, stopping briefly on the projection screen. then finally settling on Naomi, and in that moment something subtle shifted again, not in her, but in everyone else who noticed where his attention rested. "Good," he said simply, stepping closer. "Then I assume Naomi Carter has already begun." The silence that followed was immediate and total, not confusion this time, but something closer to disbelief. Daniel's jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in realization that came too late to hide. "You know her?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled, but edged with something he could not fully suppress. The man gave a small nod, his expression neutral but certain. "She is the reason I agreed to this meeting." A ripple moved through the room, sharper than before. Chairs shifted, papers stilled, every eye turning back to Naomi, as if seeing her for the first time. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the man, recalculating rapidly. "She is not listed as part of your team," he said. Holding on to what little certainty he had left, the man allowed a brief pause before answering, letting the weight of it settle. "That is because she leads the analysis, not the introductions." Another silence, deeper now, heavier, the kind that presses down rather than freezes. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting lightly near the laptop, not claiming the moment, not reacting to it, just existing within it as if none of this altered who she was. Daniel's eyes returned to the screen, then to the claws still open in front of him, then finally back to her, the pieces aligning in a way that left no room for denial. "You built this model," he said, not as a question, but as a statement he needed to hear out loud. Naomi met his gaze again, calm, steady. "Yes," she replied, and that single word landed harder than anything else that had been said, because it did not defend, it did not explain, it simply confirmed. The man beside her stepped back slightly, giving the space back to her without announcing it, as if the room itself now belonged to the person who had been dismissed only minutes before. Daniel leaned back slowly, his hand resting against the table, no longer reaching for control, no longer interrupting, just absorbing the shift that had already happened, not in the deal, but in the balance of who held the truth in the room. No one spoke for a moment after that, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from recognition. Daniel's gaze lingered on Naomi longer than before, not searching for flaws now, but trying to understand how he had missed what was sitting directly in front of him. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself as the weight of the situation settled deeper. "Walk me through it," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of the sharpness it carried earlier. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Naomi did not react to the change in tone. She simply nodded once and turned the laptop slightly, the screen adjusting as new layers of data unfolded. "The liability is not the only issue," she began, her voice calm, steady, each word placed with precision. "The projected growth assumes stability in sectors that have already shown volatility in the last 18 months. A few executives exchanged glances, their earlier confidence now replaced with careful attention. Naomi continued without hesitation, guiding them through the numbers, not overwhelming, not rushing, just revealing, piece by piece, how the structure they had trusted was built on assumptions that no longer held. Daniel listened, really listened this time, his eyes moving between the screen and the documents, his mind recalibrating with each point she made. The man who had entered the room earlier stepped aside completely now, no longer the center of attention. The focus had shifted entirely, and no one tried to take it back. "If you proceed as planned," Naomi added, her tone unchanged, "you will not see the loss immediately, but it will surface within 6 to 9 months, and by then it will be too late to restructure without significant damage." The words settled into the room with quiet force, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, undeniable. One of the senior partners leaned back slowly, exhaling as if releasing something he had been holding on to. "We missed this," he said under his breath, not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by everyone. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not resistance, it was acceptance forming in real time. He glanced at Naomi once more, then at the projection, then back at her. "What is your recommendation?" he asked, and this time there was no hesitation in the question, no underlying dismissal, just direct acknowledgement of her authority in that moment. Naomi paused for a brief second, not because she needed time, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. Then she moved the slide forward, revealing a revised structure, cleaner, tighter, built on adjustments that reflected the reality they had ignored. "You restructure the agreement here," she said, pointing lightly, "and redistribute the exposure before signing. It will reduce short-term gains, but it protects long-term stability." The room absorbed it, the logic, the clarity, the simplicity of a solution that had been invisible until now. Daniel leaned back slowly, his hand falling still against the table. The authority he had carried into the room was still there, but it no longer defined the conversation, because for the first time since the meeting began, he was not the one leading it, and he knew it. The room did not erupt into discussion. It did the opposite. It settled, as if every person present understood that speaking too quickly would break something fragile that had just formed. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the revised structure Naomi had laid out, the clean lines of logic replacing what now looked like unnecessary complexity. His fingers, which had tapped with quiet impatience earlier, now rested flat against the glass, unmoving, as if even that small motion would interrupt the clarity in front of him. The sunlight had shifted slightly across the table, casting a softer glow over the documents, over the screen, over Naomi's hands as they remained steady near the laptop. She did not lean forward, did not press her advantage. She simply allowed the silence to exist, and that silence did something no argument could have done. It gave space for realization to take root. One of the executives exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, but enough to signal a release of tension that had been building since the meeting began. Another adjusted his papers without looking down, his attention still fixed on the screen, as if afraid to lose the thread of understanding. Daniel finally leaned back, not in dismissal, but in reflection, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window, where the city stretched out in quiet motion far below, cars moving in steady lines, people crossing intersections, a world continuing without pause. And for a brief second, the contrast between that constant movement and the stillness in the room became clear. He brought his eyes back to Naomi, not with urgency, not with authority, but with a kind of measured respect that had not been there before. "You saw this in how long?" he asked, his voice even, the question carrying more curiosity than challenge. Naomi did not hesitate. "About 40 minutes, she replied, her tone unchanged. And that answer landed softly, but it echoed, not because of its volume, but because of what it implied. Daniel's lips pressed together briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of the gap between what had been assumed and what was real. He glanced down at the contract again, then closed it gently, the sound of paper folding marking a quiet shift. "We are not signing this today," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need reinforcement. No one argued, no one questioned. The decision moved through the room like a current, accepted without resistance, because the foundation it had been built on had already been dismantled. Naomi lowered her hand from the screen, the projections still visible, but no longer the center of attention. The focus had moved beyond the numbers now, into something less visible but far more significant. Daniel rested his forearms on the table, leaning forward slightly, his posture no longer defensive, no longer commanding, but engaged. "You prevented a mistake," he said, the words simple, direct, but carrying weight. Naomi met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the screen, not absorbing the praise, not deflecting it either, just letting it pass through. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer tense. It was reflective, like the aftermath of something understood too late and corrected just in time. And in that quiet, the earlier laughter, the earlier assumptions, felt distant, almost unreal, replaced by a new awareness that no one in the room could fully ignore anymore. The decision settled into the room, like a final note that did not need to be repeated. Papers remained closed, laptops untouched, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one was trying to prove anything. Daniel's gaze lingered on Naomi a moment longer before he shifted slightly in his chair, not to reclaim authority, but to face her directly. "Where did you train?" he asked, the question quieter now, stripped of assumption, carrying something closer to respect than curiosity. Naomi did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved briefly to the window where the light had softened against the skyline, then back to him. Harvard, she said, simple, without emphasis, and that single word moved through the room differently than anything before it. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise. One of the executives blinked, another straightened slightly, as if recalibrating his own memory of the last 10 minutes. Daniel did not react outwardly, but the stillness in his posture deepened, the kind of stillness that comes when something internal shifts into place. Graduated top of my class, Naomi added, not as a correction, not as a defense, just as fact. And for a brief second, the earlier laughter echoed in contrast, not in sound, but in memory, making the present moment feel sharper, more defined. Daniel's hand moved slowly across the table, not reaching for control, not reaching for interruption, just resting there as if anchoring himself to what was now undeniable. And you are here because, he began, but the question did not finish the way he expected. Naomi's answer came before he could shape it fully. Because I was not given a seat at the table, she said, her tone even, her expression unchanged. The words were not accusatory, not emotional, but they landed with a quiet weight that filled the space between them. A few people shifted in their chairs, not from discomfort, but from recognition. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief second to the glass surface beneath his hands, where the reflection of the room looked almost identical but felt entirely different. And yet you took one, he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi did not respond to that. She simply closed the laptop halfway, the soft click marking a transition that no one had announced. The man who had entered earlier gave a slight nod, not to Daniel, not to the room, but to Naomi. Acknowledging something that had already been proven, Daniel lifted his eyes again, meeting hers with a clarity that had not been there before, not trying to undo what had happened, not trying to justify it, just seeing it for what it was. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding settling into place. And in that silence, the imbalance that had defined the beginning of the meeting no longer existed, not because it had been corrected by words, but because it had been replaced by something far more difficult to ignore, the truth standing calmly in front of them. Exactly where it had been all along. Daniel did not speak right away, the weight of her words still settling somewhere deeper than the conversation itself. His eyes remained on her, but not with authority anymore, not with judgment, just with a kind of quiet clarity that had replaced everything else. He straightened slowly in his chair, the movement deliberate, controlled, as if he understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything he had said before. You should have been introduced properly, he said finally, his voice steady, but stripped of the distance it carried at the beginning. The room absorbed it, not as an apology in form, but as an acknowledgement in truth. Naomi did not respond immediately. Her gaze shifted briefly to the table, to the reflections of the people who had looked past her, then back to him. That would not have changed what you saw, she said, calm, not confrontational, just honest, and the words landed in a way that left no space for defense. Daniel exhaled slowly, a small breath, but it carried the weight of recognition. No, he admitted, quieter now. It would not have. A subtle shift moved through the room, not visible, but felt, like something unspoken had been named without needing to be expanded. One of the executives lowered his eyes, another leaned back slightly, the earlier confidence replaced with a more careful awareness. Daniel's hand moved across the table, not toward control, but toward something else, something more measured. You were right to speak, he said, and this time the words were directed fully at her, not at the room, not at the situation, but at the person he had misjudged. Naomi held his gaze for a brief second, then nodded once, not accepting, not rejecting, just acknowledging. The man who had entered earlier stepped forward slightly, his presence returning just enough to close the space between what had happened and what would come next. We will proceed with the revised structure, he said, his tone calm, but firm, and no one questioned it, no one needed to, because the decision had already been made long before it was spoken. Daniel glanced at the documents, then pushed them slightly forward, away from himself, a small gesture, but one that marked a clear shift in position. I would like you to lead the revision, he said, looking back at Naomi. The request simple, but carrying a recognition that had not existed an hour ago. The room felt it, not as a dramatic turn, but as a quiet correction. Naomi paused for a brief moment, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what that moment represented. Then she gave a small nod. I will, she said, her voice even, steady, unchanged by the shift around her. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show that something had been released, not control, but assumption. The light from the windows had shifted again, softer now, stretching across the table in long reflections. The room felt different, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood. And in that quiet space, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one questioned why she was there anymore. Because for the first time, that question no longer existed. The meeting did not end with applause or final words. It ended with movement, quiet, deliberate, each person gathering their things without the usual urgency, as if something in the room had slowed time itself. Daniel remained seated a moment longer after the others began to stand, his eyes following Naomi as she closed her laptop fully now, the soft click echoing gently against the glass and marble, not loud, but final. She stood with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, not elevated by what had happened, not diminished by what came before, just steady, present, real. The light from the windows stretched across the floor in long, golden lines as she stepped away from the chair she had taken without permission and now left without hesitation. No one stopped her, no one questioned her path. They simply made space, instinctively, without being told. Daniel rose slowly, not to regain position, but because remaining seated no longer felt right. His gaze followed her to the edge of the room, then paused, as if something unspoken held him there. Naomi, he said, his voice measured, not loud, but enough to reach her before she crossed the threshold. She stopped, turned slightly, her expression unchanged, waiting, not expectant, not guarded, just open. Daniel took a step forward, the distance between them no longer defined by authority, but by understanding. You did more than correct a contract today, he said, the words careful, chosen, not rehearsed. You corrected a perspective. The room, now nearly empty, held that sentence in the air, not as a lesson, but as a realization that had come too late to prevent the mistake, but just in time to change what followed. Naomi looked at him for a brief moment, her eyes steady, then gave a small nod, not accepting credit, not denying it, simply acknowledging what had been said without adding to it. She turned again and walked toward the door, her steps quiet against the floor, each one carrying her further from the room that had almost dismissed her. Daniel stood where he was, watching, not with regret alone, but with something deeper, something that would not leave as easily as the others had. The door opened, then closed, softly behind her, and the room fell into a different kind of silence, not empty, not unresolved, but full of something that could not be undone. Daniel looked down at the glass table,